Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Real Life. Today joining me, I have Rochelle. Welcome, Rochelle.
Thanks, Tash.
In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the concept of identity and how that's changed over time in film. In particular, we're going to be looking at teen films, ideas of ethnicity, as well as gender, and how these have been shown in films. What have you got to start us off with, Rochelle?
Well, I thought we'd start talking about the latest film that Australia's produced that it's called Girl Asleep. And it's currently doing the film circuit and coming up with an amazing amount of awards. The Melbourne International Film Festival, the Critics' Choice Award, CineFest, it's just doing wonders. And what it is, it's a story again focusing on the teen coming of age. And it focuses on a young girl called Greta. She's just changed schools, she's turning 15, she's a lonesome girl outside of her best friend, and her parents decide to throw her a party. That's all fine. The problem is that her parents are throwing a party and inviting the entire school. So this gorgeous little girl that's used to being alone is suddenly fraught with all of these external forces that are creating a shift in her own sense of identity. It's a beautiful film that, it brings up whimsical elements, violent elements, concerning elements, all within this beautiful storytelling. And it's only when she's in this world that she can lose herself and therefore find herself. It's a beautiful story.
Sounds awesome. Let's have a look at a clip.
Oi, come on, lights out.
Comfy? Not, sweetheart.
We like you, new girl. He's not invited. So did you want to hang out?
You should have like an awesome party or something.
I'll get you a new dress and we'll get your hair and makeup done. We can all do it.
Ta-da!
No party, all right?
Crazy party, huh?
What that film reminds me of is another coming-of-age film that came out in the last few years, The Perks of Being a Wallflower. And what was interesting about that film is it was one teen film that kind of looked at the less imperfect time of that age, because a lot of films prior to that had kind of made it seem like the glory years or the ugly duckling and you always turned into a beautiful swan, and didn't really look at those gritty elements.
Yeah.
Growing up, were there any particular films that you looked at or kind of felt represented you in the teen?
There was a film that was made back in #85, and it was called The Breakfast Club, and it's since become a cult classic. The Breakfast Club was a story about 5 teen students that were all given detention together on a Saturday. What's really interesting is that these 5 teenagers all reflect a different stereotype. There's a jock, there's the renegade, there's the internal girl, there's the pretty girl, there's the geek. So really creating very clean sense of identity. But what happens when they're thrown into a detention is that they're put into a space where they have to find themselves amongst this collective. So there's lots of arguing, there's lots of laughing, there's lots of engaging and testing the waters on ideas that teenagers are concerned about the first kiss, have you had sex, have you smoked dope? So all these wonderful ideas that are coming up and being presented in very stereotypical fashion. But it had a great impact on me because not only did it give you, a variety of different ideas of a teenager's journey, but it also allowed it all to be very inclusive. It allowed you to not feel like you were so isolated and alone. And I think that's the beauty of films like this. Was there anything for you?
Yeah, there was for me. It was Looking for Alibrandi, and I think it was an Australian film. It was set in Sydney, so in that sense it was incredibly familiar. And also it dealt with a young girl who came from an Italian family, and I came from a Greek family, and I'd never seen anything like that on the screen before. The other thing about that was that she came from, what was a broken family, and there was guilt and there were secrets, and once again it kind of broke down that Hollywood ideal that we have seen before. So should we take a look at a clip?
Let's have a look.
looking for Alibrandi.
I'm going home with the wrong guy. I'm going home in a panel van.
An interesting thing about Looking for Alibrandi is that it was adapted by from the Melina Marchetta novel of the same name. And one of the things that you and I are both really interested in is this whole idea of women in film. So we've got some facts here. So only 22% of women are portrayed as protagonists in film. So that's just over a fifth.
Yeah.
And only a third of women in film seem to have a speaking role. And in Girl Asleep, we see, you know, a young female character, and we also have a female director. And how do you think that that dynamic is changing, and are we seeing more women in film?
Oh, look, I don't think it's changing as progressively as what it needs to. Clearly, by the statistics, it's not. We're not really getting there. I think what we're predominantly seeing is a lot of female directors and writers and producers coming up in the indie film area, but not quite in the commercial area. And again, of course, it's different across, you know, Australian films through to American films to European films. There's a different culture, there's a different set of rules that go on, a different ideology around the arts. In Australia, we don't have such a large industry. It's quite a small industry, and a part of that is because we don't have the extra funding that goes into it. So a lot of things that do get funded are predominantly the bigger hero's journey story or the anti-hero's story, and historically that's been a male role. What we've also found historically in Australia is that writers and directors have been male. So of course a writer is going to firsthand write about what they know, and what they know is a male psyche. So there has been a predominant, you know, series of you know, years of films with male protagonists. Certainly women are coming up, and now that there are awards that and funding that's available specifically to encourage more filmmakers, more female writers, more female producers, we are starting to see a little bit more diversity, but I really think there's a long way to go, because there are amazing stories to be told leading in with a female protagonist. I think it's something we really need to build on here in Australia. I know that America, for example, is looking at policy reform in terms of gender, you know, equal gender within the roles of who's doing what in American film. And not only gender, they're also looking at identity, a cultural identity. So I think, you know, it's only you know, time until Australia actually jumps on that bandwagon and we're able to really start encouraging and endorsing a broader range of stories, because we have wonderful stories here to tell, and you know, hopefully we won't just keep missing the gap.
And speaking of wonderful stories to tell, obviously we have a rich Indigenous culture here in Australia, and we've started to see lately more films and even TV shows dealing with those topics. So, you know, Channel 7 just had that new show, The Secret Daughter, and kind of bringing into mainstream culture these alternate stories such as the Sapphires and whatnot. It's a very fine line, because even with the female directors and encouragement through awards, you don't want to trivialise or make a novel, I guess, like, oh look, there's a woman director, let's give her an award and make it that other.
Yes.
Do you think that we're succeeding in genuinely telling stories that people are interested in hearing when it comes to the diversity of cultures in Australia?
I think where we're succeeding is in a very small arena, and it's because it's being led by, as we just discussed, specific awards or specific support for, you know, an Indigenous filmmaker who produced, you know, Samson and Delilah is a beautiful example. So it's, you know, a story of two young teens and their, you know, their journey through love, through self exploration, through their you know, their heritage, through their dream time, through dealing with homelessness, with drugs, with, you know, sniffing of petrol, with their community. But this story could only be told because there was funding that was available for Indigenous filmmakers, and this was a magnificent piece of work that came out of it, and it's internationally recognised. Look, we are starting to see shift in terms of television is starting to show where there is diversity. If we look at, you know, a number of years ago we were presenting Redfern Now, you know, telling gritty stories of Redfern with Indigenous and what's going on in their smaller communities, on the streets. Some wonderful stories being told, you know, and again, thanks to AVC for supporting those wonderful stories. You know, we've also seen it on the recent Clever Man, which has been, you know, a piece that's using Indigenous dream time, also with a level of fantasy, and bringing in some science fiction. So there's, you know, wonderful level at which we're able to bring it to a wider audience, to be able to celebrate the diversity of Australian culture. But I think, again, we need to just create more seed funding for all of this, more support for the artists and for the diversity of the artists that are able to create this work. And then we'll be able to see a great shift in the culture of Australian film and television.
It's definitely a very exciting time for Australian film.
It is. Shall we throw it to a clip of Samson and Delilah?
Just before we wrap up, let's have a look.
Sure. Let's have a look at a clip now from Samson and Delilah.
So that's the final clip from today's episode, and we'll have to wrap up the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on Real Life. A big thank you to Rochelle Mahue. I'm Natasha Stemos. Goodbye.
Goodbye.